I'm Andrew Jarman. I'm an architect at Ellis Williams Architects. I'm Ambassador for the Architects Benevolent Society. So I'll just quickly introduce the panel. Ian Wroot is head of John Moores Architecture School. Alex Dusterloh, deputy head at University of Liverpool. Kirkpatrick is an architect at EPR Architects in London, and ambassador for the ABS as well. Lisa wrote her dissertation on Wellbeing in the architecture
students. Yeah, exactly.
Lisa Raynes is founder of Pride Road Architects, and Sarah Harrison, director of Harrison Stringfellow. So I'd just like to start, if you could all perhaps just briefly introduce, I guess, your own, just to contextualise your own experiences of practice and academia briefly in, any experiences of wellbeing that you think is sort of relevant, whether you think it's good, bad, just a bit of an overview of your experience.
Okay.
So let's start.
Sure. Okay. I'm Sarah Harrison from Harrison Stringfellow. We're based in Penny Lane here in Liverpool, and we've been going for about 12 years now, and we have 9 members of staff. Out of those 9 members of staff, we have a selection of full-time and part-time and job share and in the office and hybrid working. We are an RIBA chartered practice, and we're also one of 9 RIBA role model practices, and we were selected for that in the way that we practice our architecture and the stall that we set out really when we set up our practice, which was to be, to sort of demonstrate, I suppose, that you could run a successful practice whilst also having a family life, because it's a female-led practice, and in the early years Sue and I had 4 children between us. We also are past winners of the McEwan Award, and last year we won the BD Social Impact Award and were highly commended for the Employer of the Year Award. So this sort of idea of wellbeing has been like a fundamental part of our practice ethos from the outset. And from a personal point of view, I've recently just made a start back, like a stage return back into work, having to take a year off, pretty much to look after my son. So I'm at the point now where I've seen it from both sides, and hopefully that will inform any discussions we have today.
Thanks. I'm Lisa Raynes. So I'm founder of Pride Road. It's an architectural practice franchise. So I've got about 23 years experience post Part 3. And I started my career in working for other people in design-led practices, and over in Manchester. And I got made redundant twice during maternity leave, so I've got 3 kids, so which led me to set up my own practice 12 years ago. So actually, we started at the same time. So I started out as Raynes Architecture, and sort of a couple of years into it, sort of systemised the business. And we just do residential extensions, and realised that I actually had a really good business model that kind of worked around family. And I knew that there was an issue in the industry for kind of women dropping out at kind of like age 30 plus, and this was potentially one solution. And so I kind of made it my goal to kind of spread the word and kind of spread best practice, and I've done it through franchising as a business model. So we launched in 2016, and there's now 5 of us across England. So 2 in the northwest, 1 down in Bournemouth, 1 in Warwick, 1 in southwest London. And we've all had a slightly kind of rocky journey, and it's a way of getting back into architecture after losing a bit of confidence, or maternity leave, or, you know, sort of issues around kids. Yeah, so there you go.
Hi, yeah, I'm Melissa Kirkpatrick, recently qualified architect. I qualified last year in November. I started my architectural education in 2013, where I studied at Sheffield Uni. And I suppose it was during undergrad I kind of started to notice there was this kind of culture which could be detrimental to mental health. Noticed a few sort of panic and anxiety problems amongst myself and peers that I thought was kind of normalised and shouldn't really be. But then I did my part 1 year out in London, and then when I went to do my master's, I decided to write my dissertation on mental health and students, architecture students. So that was how I originally got involved with the ABS, the charity Andrew mentioned. They sponsored the dissertation, and I kind of looked at a comparison between the typical university student and sort of an architecture student, using some data that was provided by RIBA. And I found that 1 in 3 students was currently struggling with mental health in some way, shape or form. Now that's gone to 1 in 2, it's been shown. So obviously the situation's kind of gotten worse since. But yeah, so that was interesting. And then I actually did my master's as collaborative practice at Sheffield Uni, which is like a blended sort of learning and practice model, where the first year of the master's you're working in practice 4 days a week, and then the Friday is dedicated to study. That was because I kind of just in a way wanted to stay in practice, but also wanted to get on with my studies, and I thought that would be good for my well-being as well. So yeah, I did that, and yeah, now I work at EPR Architects and I'm qualified. So yeah, summary.
Hello everyone, Alex Dusterloh. I'm now the Deputy Head of Department at the Liverpool School of Architecture up at the university, so I represent the academics on this panel. I started my education at Brighton University, a former polytechnic with a very structured timetable and very much a continuation of school. Before joining practice, I worked in London and in Manchester for places like Foster and Partners, and up in the northwest for Hodder Associates, Chet KM, and a number of other places in the region. 2 of those places made me sign a disclaimer that I wouldn't work to the European Directive of Working Hours. I won't name which 2 practices that were. But obviously, I then did my part 2 up at Liverpool, and then after 10 years in practice, found my way back into teaching, and I'm now a full-time educator rather than a conventional academic. But I'm obviously very interested in what is our role as a university and an institution. Are we part of the problem that we institutionalize certain behavior in our students that then gets taken into practice, or are we, as we sometimes are asked to be, practice for practice, and are we only responding to the world that exists out there, as people sometimes describe? But anyway, I look forward to the discussion this evening.
Hi, my name is Ian Wroot. I'm the Head of Architecture, and I'm currently the Interim School Director. I suppose my journey is quite similar. Prior to going into education, I worked in medium-sized practice in Liverpool and Manchester, SME size, up to 50 staff. As I moved into education, I became a part-time tutor and started a small practice, which my wife continues to run. So I've had experience of kind of starting up a small practice and managing the small practice and the pressures that come. So the different pressures between being a paid employee in architectural practice and being the employer in architectural practices. So I've had a bit of experience in those 2 fields. In terms of in education, I've kind of gone through every role really, from a part-time tutor to a module leader to a program leader to a subject head. I was on the university's board of governors for a few years, and I also worked for the university's estate department for a few years, managing the estate. So kind of had various roles in the university. And all of those have thought about the student experience and seen how it's changed over the years. And student hardship and mental health is a big issue for all universities, and it particularly impacts disciplines like architecture. And part of it is the length of the course. The workload of the course is something that Andrew's put on the list of things to discuss. And I agree, we constantly think of are we setting in motion certain behaviours that are reinforcing behaviours in practice or vice versa. So that's, I think, what this discussion is all about.
Thank you. So I'm just going to, well, I was going to, the keyboard would like, flick through a couple of slides quickly. Can I just ask, by way of show of hands, how many people are in practice? And how many people are students? So I'm not gonna go into too much detail, but I just wanted to mention the Architects Benevolent Society. So myself and Melissa are both ambassadors for the ABS. The ABS basically provides support for people, students, people in practice, people who work for an architectural practice who are not necessarily architects, and dependents of architects. So there's a few more links at the end, but if anyone does feel like they could do with some support, I just urge you to get in touch with the ABS. They kindly provided me with a few slides. So you can see here, so they started a mental health offering of support in 2017, and within 5 years of that being an offer, it's quickly become massively the majority of support that they offer for architects and students. So I think that speaks for itself, given that they've been in existence for about 150 years. And then you can obviously just see a bit of a summary of the reasons why people come to the ABS. So essentially we've got 15%, 16% that isn't work related, is purely personal reasons, and then all of the rest of it is obviously a combination of reasons, well 40% nearly for purely work related stress. So I think it's just interesting to see some of these figures really, just as a bit of a primer. And again, these are just something you can see Melissa being quoted on the slide. So yeah, just, you know, mental health report is the biggest single worry for respondents under 30. And these are just some of the, I think, some of the highlights from, so there's the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum, which is another thing that's probably worth checking out if anyone wants to learn a bit more. They've got a lot of really good resources there. And these are just some of the summary points that they came up with as, you know, key issues, which I'm sure most people are probably aware of.
Oh yeah, just to mention, I'm a member there as well, and we've got a toolkit online for both practices and students that just gives some kind of basic tips for everyone on how to look after well-being, of your own well-being, or if you're a tutor, your students' well-being, or if you're an employer, then your employees' well-being as well. So worth checking out.
And yeah, I think again there's some of the, I guess some of the ways that we can improve the situation. So just wanted to use that as a little bit of a primer. As you can see that, so that's from the Architecture Journal Student Survey for 2022. So there's quite a lot, you know, 50% of females, over 50% are either currently being treated or have sought help in the past. So obviously, this is 1 in 2. It's of get needed mental health help. So, Ian, you touched on workload just there. I'd be interested to see who thinks at uni you have to do too much work. So, quite a lot of people. So I'm just wondering. I want to sort of start with academia first, and then work through. I'm interested in how you've obviously got validation criteria that you need to fulfil, and there's different you've got different modules that are sort of largely around you've got a design studio, and then you've got sort of periphery modules typically. But design studio, a lot of the time, there isn't, from what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong on the courses, but from what I remember, the amount of work you have to produce for your outputs was not prescriptive. So, just playing devil's advocate here, a lot of us are saying, well, there's too much work. How do you, but then if a lot of our work at design studio level is not prescribed, there's just a conflict there. I'm interested in how you guys sort of assess workloads and how you get to a point where you think, well, what is this bit of work too much, or and with design studio outputs, what is there? Should we be guiding students more on on the amount that they need to produce, or about how more things can be combined?
Well, it's an interesting question because I was thinking about this. I was reading some research that was done by one of our external examiners, which was published. It was funded by the RIBA actually, so I thought I'd read it. But it is 100 pages long. So, and one interesting thing that was raised there, and they did lots of research around that, not just of schools of architecture here, was the impact of digital technology, say. So in my day, when I'm working on the drawing board and I'm thinking, should I do that fourth elevation, and then how much should I colour in? And you get to the point, when do I stop? When is enough enough? When have I described the work enough? And that's a difficult thing to make too prescriptive because it varies with project. But the interesting thing is the impact of digital technology, according to the research, has made things worse in a certain extent because you can produce more stuff quickly and you end up with more and more production. And what we find if you looked at the amount of stuff that the student submits now to the stuff in my day when working on a drawing board, there is more content. And it just proliferates. It's like the more efficient tools we have, the more we produce. And it comes to a point where you've got to draw a line and say, we're after quality, not quantity. But on top of that, it's not just the architectural studio culture, which we should talk about that separately as a topic, because that's something that is something to discuss. It's the modular system as well of a university and the validation criteria with small modules. In my day, we did semester-long projects in just one project. And it's all been chopped up, and I think that has exacerbated it to some extent. But in terms of workload and if I could say remuneration, what I talk to my students about, because we are in this module credit world, aren't we? And I do say, well, a credit's 10 hours, and if you're in practice, you have to say, how much work am I doing and how much am I getting paid for that work? When you're at university, I try to encourage students to have that same discipline and say, I might not prescribe exactly what you want to do, but we can tell you how many hours it should take. And the research said you should never work over 40 hours. 24-hour studio access is just a bad habit to get into. And you should say, I'll put a reasonable amount of hours into it, but I need to be productive. And actually one of the problems is procrastination. You can feel like you're putting a lot of work in without achieving much, and that's one of the problems as well we work with.
Do you find it different when people come back for the part two? Because I think, you know,
Yes.
I remember like approaching it quite differently coming back because A, I was doing a part-time job, but B, I'd been used to us having that, you know, 40-hour week and being able to
Yes.
clock off a little bit.
And it's part of it is you're more workmanlike because you've been in a practice environment, and you're just more mature and you know what's expected. When you first go into architectural education, you don't really know what the tutors want. They're speaking a different language, and you're kind of saying, you know, I don't really know what you want me to do, because you're not describing it clearly enough, and that's part of the problems in the early year training. And that's what causes a lot of anxiety, I think, in students, that lack of clarity of what's required, which we try and do a lot of work on. I think education's improved in that respect, actually. I think we do give more clarity.
Yeah, I mean, if I can pick up on some of that. I think first and foremost, in studio design, it's a design problem that is being set. A design problem, by definition, doesn't have a solution predefined. We don't design the building and think, oh, this is a nice design. So we'll now write a brief that, and then ask students to reproduce the design we have come up with. We set a design problem, and that is open-ended. We just say, run in that direction and see how far you get. We're like Ian, we try and manage it through time. We tell people spend 20 hours a week on this module, spend 10 hours. And that is another skill they're meant to learn, which is time management. I think there is also a habit that students are getting into of occupying themselves with stuff that isn't entirely relevant to architectural design. And students spend a lot of time researching fascinating avenues that ultimately don't inform the spatial design of their eventual building. And that is another lesson they need to learn. And then I think the last point I would make is what Ian was saying about when you first go into education, you try to figure out what the tutor wants you to produce. What is that product that you want me to make for you, please? When actually what we're trying to teach them is the process. We are far less concerned about the product to start off with. And it's the process. And again, there's lots of research on this difference between the reflective practitioner who uses the process to find the solution and the student who's just so obsessed with trying to find the solution right from the outset. So I think, to answer your question, how do we manage it? We're trying to manage it by giving people a certain amount of time. But I wouldn't want to sit down at the beginning of a project and say, this is the design we want you to reproduce, please. So I think that's probably my point.
I wonder if, instead of, I suppose, setting like what the design should be at the beginning of a design project, maybe at the beginning of university entirely there should be more workshops or something like that to kind of teach the kind of principles you were both just mentioning, I suppose, the kind of mistakes and pitfalls that people fall into a lot, and actually teaching time management. Maybe that should be part of the module, because clearly that is something that's quite hard in architecture, and storyboarding is obviously so important, a good skill to learn from the beginning. But yeah, I don't know how much of that is kind of brought up at the very beginning, like year one.
I think part of it's time management, but part of it's the transition from secondary education. And I think secondary education, you get a lot of positive feedback. Everything's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that transition to critical feedback is a big change. It's a step change, and I think that's a challenge. And that's part of explaining that the process, the studio culture is that you come up with a proposition, you discuss it with your colleagues and tutors, and at certain moments you defend an idea and you get critical feedback. And I think that takes a while to change that mindset, I think.
Yeah, sorry, go for it.
I was just saying, playing devil's advocate again a little bit, I completely agree about the process, and that is definitely the joy in how you come about the better solutions. But ultimately, from a student's point of view, at the end of their part one or the end of their part two, they've got to put a CV out there and a portfolio, which are like way, way fancier than we probably did. And, it's a competitive market, and we are ultimately visual creatures, and I have to say, you know, sometimes I look at things that are produced at end of year degree shows and I'm like, I can't really read that because it's just there's so much kind of going on, and it's a different style to what I had. But I suppose when you're talking about what's the output, you know, they've still got to, it's very hard to explain how in depth you did a process and how many iterations you did and who you consulted or what it was about that thing that was so interesting, you know, when you're trying to catch the eye of an employer. So I don't know what the solution to that is. I'm just, yeah, so.
Well, maybe the solution is that students could start drawing their plan, section and elevation a lot earlier, and, you know, rather than trying to draw it at the end and have this big surprise, hey, you never saw this one before, when actually, sorry, again, in our days, I'm feeling very old suddenly, you had no choice but to show the drawing every week because it would take you weeks and weeks to produce the drawing, picking up Ian's point about thinking you can do it on the computer so much quicker. You kind of don't show your tutor that final drawing because, well, I want to surprise them, I want to have the big impact or whatever. So I think that's a problem. I think Ian's point about secondary education is another big point, and that is it's very formulaic, and I mean that in the nicest way, anyone involved in secondary education. But I have children now in secondary education, and for example, they're being taught what a good book review looks like, and it must have this many quotes, this many citations, and we have now students asking us, how do you design? Where's that formula? You know, a good design must have, you know, one two-story element, one single-story element, and a door facing west. Of course, that's not the way to do it. So I think there's a lot of unlearning to do. And I agree with you, let's have time management as a thing. But as Ian said, you know, we're already mapping the course against 44 general criteria that the ARB prescribe, plus 8 graduate attributes at part 1 and I think 9 at part 2. We can make an even longer list, but I don't think more kind of regulation in that way is a way forward. I think it's a more fundamental thing about making it clear to students what they're being asked to produce and how much time they should spend on it, rather than maybe letting them go off into weird tangents.
I think the issue is that you can't write a project brief and give it to 30 students and that will prescribe what each of those 30 students do. What they need is a kind of personal trainer who will give them their individual feedback on what's appropriate for their project. And that is the skill of the course. In fact, that's the strength of the architecture education, that you get that one-to-one. But it relies on having good tutors who sit in front of you and don't confuse you.
Yeah.
And that can be very damaging, I think, when you have, you know, the old-fashioned way of tutors standing in front of students and trying to make themselves look intelligent, but confusing the student. I think that's hopefully we've moved away from that world a little bit.
Yeah, it is interesting actually. It really depends, and this was said a lot during my masters. Everyone said it depends what tutor you get. Like, that will really determine whether you do well or not, which is quite interesting and also quite difficult, I suppose. You should be able to do well, whoever you get, but I guess there's just a big difference in how different people teach, and while some people might encourage plans and sections to be drawn early, some tutors might say, no, leave that till the very end, just keep iterating the concept sort of thing. But it just really varies.
And some tutors, you know, will say, let's push through the night and really give it a good go, you know, one last, you know, I went through this and I think you'll
really
benefit from it. And other
sometimes.
tutors will say, make sure you get some sleep tonight before the review. But the strength is also our biggest problem, the strength of the education, which is this one-to-one. And that means up at Liverpool University, we employ 48 fractional members of staff in our undergraduate course alone. There is variation between them, and not every student will click with every tutor, and you need to be exposed to different people as well, which is another part of the learning process, isn't it? But I get very alarmed when people kind of say, if you work with that tutor, you'll get a good mark.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got Alex, he'll work you hard, but you probably won't get a very good mark. I mean, that would worry me enormously, and that, I think there's a fundamental problem in the way that university is assessing work, because it shouldn't happen that way. We should be marking the work, not the person. because before you know it, you're marking people on the way they appear, the way they behave and conduct themselves, what clothes they wear, or what socioeconomic background they come from, and that is, that should never happen.
There is you modify the way you teach, because it's coming together of two personalities, and so you either modify the way you teach, or you can say, well, there's someone else who would teach you better because the way you approach a project suits the way that they teach, and you do get that, and we do have the kind of rotation. You do tend to get a lot of experiences of different types of teaching, which I think is helpful. But you will come across one experience where it doesn't marry with you as well as some others, and I think it'd be difficult if you just found one way of doing something through 5 years of university and just repeat it again and again. You want to face different approaches.
I suppose what you really want is for the students to become good designers, but sometimes students are very marks focused, I suppose, as opposed to process focused. But then it's tricky because then when you come to apply for jobs, they're looking for grades at the same time.
It depends what you mark, because if you grade in the process, then that is marks focused. I mean, I have that discussion now with the graphics team in my new role, and say, well, because I think architecture does that less than other disciplines in this school, where if you look with fine art and graphics, it's all about the process. Mm-hmm. We have the situation where at the end of the day, people can't burn to death in the building, and there are certain things you can't be all process that leads to a product that doesn't work. So we have to have that balance between experimentation and the pressure in university now is that every student passes first time, and there's no failure, and that's a big challenge, I think, in education, because experimentation requires failure. Otherwise it's not experimentation. But that has to be in the process, and it has to be done in such a way that doesn't destroy the confidence of a student. It's got to come across that failure is a positive thing. It's the road to success, in that you're eliminating options and you're trying different ways of doing things. And the Marxists should appreciate that.
And I think that comes in practice, and I say this all of the time, that people who've been working for a while, no matter what level they're at, then it's more about understand. You've got to be able to do the whole process, so that when you go back to the beginning to do the next project, you're obviously learning from that, and it's more about learning what not to do than what to do sometimes, because you've got to go through sometimes that very painful process of sitting and reading part B and working out all of the fire stuff, and then it still not working. But next time you'll be like, well, I'm not going to even design it in that sort of shape because I know it won't meet those regs. And that is a continuous loop then throughout your career. And it's got, and it does have to start at university, because ultimately when you get into practice, you do have to make sure people aren't going to die in your building. Whereas, particularly the beauty of part 2 is that is the time when you know it's your last hurrah potentially for doing that experimentation and doing research into slightly crazy tangents and things, because you've got that buffer of time to do it. So yeah, it does all come back round.
Is there an opportunity to put less weighting on the final product? Because I think Sarah just hit on a note about it being your last hurrah. Probably one thing I regret about uni is actually taking it too seriously. And actually I should have just gone, to hell with this, just have fun with it a bit more and not worry about the result quite as much. Do the validation criteria, do they affect weighting of it? If your pin up at the end is basically your whole project mark, is there not an opportunity to have checkpoints that could reference, even just helping people understand that structure of, if you have you could have one checkpoint in the project where you've got to have some sort of grading, and you could perhaps reference, either that being the time when a D&B contract was novated, or RIBA checkpoints, because it will come on to practice shortly. But there's also that kind of, one of the biggest criticisms of students is that they go into practice and they just don't know anything. I don't think, I think an architectural education is great, because it teaches you about critical thinking. But I don't know.
Well, when you say you don't know anything, you've learnt certain transferable skills in problem solving. You know, knowledge is about experience. You might not know an acronym that's used in practice. You might not know procedures that are used in practice. But we're not in university to teach that. You go into practice to learn practice. You can't learn to swim without going in the pool, and you can't learn to practice without being in practice. You can't replicate practice in a university. So I think the university has a different role. The university is there to make you think deeply about the discipline and to give you transferable skills that will you might not use the first year in practice, but hopefully they'll go through. You'll always think things through from first principles, and you'll always challenge anything that's put to you and question it. And I think those are the skills that you should learn in schools.
To pick up your point, Andrew, I think it would be wonderful if we could go back to a time when at Part 2 level we didn't award first honours, upper second, lower second, and it was pass, fail, distinction. Because actually from a professional accreditation point of view, it's an on-off. You know, you either are competent enough to be Part 2 or you're not, and therefore you must fail. And it's picking up your point about there is this obsession, I think, in the system with marks. It's how we are as institutions judged. There's an algorithm that calculates how likely an incoming student is to graduate with a 2-1 or first. If we outperform that algorithm, we get value-added score, which pushes us up in the league tables, which is one of the reasons why grade inflation is a massive problem, because good grades must mean good education. If we could get away from this obsession with, you know, is it a 2-1, is it a first, it would make marking so much easier. And actually we would concentrate on, is it good enough, is it bad enough, or is it actually outstanding for whatever the criteria for that might be. I would love for us to be able to go back to that. But that's not the way the world is going, if you like, because we are looking at things of how to add value in higher education, and therefore grades have become really, really important, just like they are in secondary education. And you know, any of us who've ever picked a school for children have probably looked at league tables and kind of put some value on them. And I know that our applicants who come to us, of course, look at where we stand in the league table, even though I think we all agree that they're not really. But tell you what, we're in the top 10 at the moment, so right now I'm a big fan of league tables. But you know, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have gone on for a long time about how they're fundamentally flawed. So.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, and I think just sort of coming on to practice a little bit more. And I guess, I think hours is probably, I think we could probably spend hours talking about hours. And, you know, I kind of feel like from what everyone said, there is actually, I don't know how we address students working too many hours, but it sounds like there's a bit of students sort of propagating that, even though, you know, some of that is just the learning experience that you have to, you don't learn how to manage your time until you've done like an all-nighter. Sort of, maybe. Hours in practice, I'm interested in what people's experiences are of having to work overtime, and there's a lot spoken about it. I personally haven't had too many bad experiences with overtime, but I think there's another part of the survey said 68% of people have never been paid for overtime, 9% rarely, and 11% sometimes. So that was from the student survey. So I think part 2 is people just from their part 1s. I think how many people would say there is a problem with working overtime hours? Not too bad. I don't know whether that's a regional thing, or Liverpool's not so bad, but in London perhaps it's worse because of the status of practices down there, or what people's experiences?
So, when I started out in practice, sort of late 90s, it was a long hours culture. It was like a race to see who could get in the office first in the morning and who could stay late at night, and then who was in at the weekend. And it was just awful. But I kind of at the time thought it was fun until I crashed. You know, because you just do hit that wall, and at that point, you know, everything just crumbles. So it forced me into a situation where I had to leave. I had to find an exit. But coming into sort of setting up my own practice, the way that we work, we've got a really simplified process. And so we start with a concept design workshop, which is hand-drawn, and we do it in front of our clients, and it's a paid piece of work, and it's a half day for a single story or full day for a 2-story. And we set it, and it's 3.5 hours or 5.5 hours, and you've just set that time aside to do a series of concepts in front of the client. And, you know, I've been doing it for about 10 years now, and it's brilliant. It's a great way of time management because you don't take it back to the office afterwards and carry on. There's a start, a middle, and an end to it. And, you know, each of those phases you've talked through the iterations with the client so they can see the processes. And it's never something I was taught how to do at university, but I wish I was, because it would have saved me so much time to do it. And then just in doing that process, you know, I know that I can manage my diary. I know that I'm going to have an outcome, you know, by the end of Tuesday afternoon, and then, you know, scan it in, send it off to the client, done and dusted. And then in terms of kind of like client management throughout a project, I know how long things take. I mean, maybe that's experience.
Yes.
But also, you know, I share that with our franchisees, and they come on board. They're qualified architects, and they learn how to manage projects in the same way pretty quickly. You know, it's, you know, one meeting at this stage, one meeting at that stage. It's an hour, it's an hour, it's an hour, it's half an hour. And that's how we fill our diary. We have a start and end of the day, and you dictate that, whether it's 9 to 5 or 9:30 to 3, and you don't go beyond that. So it's those time management skills that I've picked up. I really wish I would have known that at university, because when we were talking beforehand about doing crits and procrastinating, it just took me back to being a year 2 student with endless sketchbooks, just filling them up for hours and days and not getting anywhere, and then standing up and having these hideous crits, and just made me feel about that big.
I think that I worked in the city centre for the first part of my career, and there definitely was some late night working there. But I think the same sort of thing. I was newly qualified and in the city, and it was kind of part of a lifestyle almost. And I don't remember particularly feeling overburdened by that, but I wasn't trying to do that as a mother. And by the time I became a mother, I had my own practice, and we set out to not have that long hours culture, and that has been to try and prove that it can be done, because we're a little bit stubborn like that as well. But it's hard, as an employer, because that in the same way that when you're first faced with a technical problem in practice, you've got to do that reading and research, and it's the same skills that you learned at university, but it's just in a very different sort of format. And sometimes you've just got to sit there and read it, and sometimes you just need to sit there and stay and work it out, because that's the first time you've done it, and then the next time it'll be way quicker because you know what pages to look at and all the rest of it. But as an employer who is trying not to force people to do long hours, it can be hard sometimes when you think, well, I need to get that out for invoicing, or I need you to get that finished because tomorrow I need you to do this piece of work for the cash flow and the workflow that you don't see the back end of. So it's very much a balancing issue, and it's not easy, I wouldn't say, but there's got to be a start somewhere, and you can't be doing late night working if you've got to get to nursery to pick your child up. It just, you just can't do it. So that is the same sort of idea of like, there's this hard gates of what time you can go past. And, because we live in a digital world, because people can have emails on their phones or in the WhatsApp group, people have got to learn to be able to step away from that. And that's either by having a separate phone, personal from work, or, switching off emails and WhatsApps. And that is a self-discipline that, I'm not your mother. I can't teach you how to do that. You've got to take some responsibility for that yourself. But again, that is sometimes experience of like thinking, oh, I've got to be able to be on call all of the time, and actually you don't. And stepping back and not being fully available all the time is sometimes a good business strategy.
I think it's interesting the point you made about technology, and I think that probably touches on what Ian was saying about students being able to choose a lot more. Like now, everyone knows we've got a model that you can, they don't know the inner workings of Revit or Vectorworks, whatever you're using, but they know that you can cut things a lot easier. It tends to be like a lot quicker now, so people are asking for information quicker. But I'm also interested in timesheets. Like, my experience is really mixed. I'm working at a practice now that I know is really hot on do your timesheets every week, make sure we know what you're spending your time on. And I've also worked somewhere where I was told in my induction, just put 7.5 hours down every day, don't worry about it. And you think, well, how can you be tracking what we're doing? That's got to be part of your financing and all that sort of stuff. Like, I think it's interesting, Lisa, what you said about it's managing expectations as well, isn't it? I think probably not the same in a bigger practice when you're working on much bigger jobs, and it's just sort of what you could do. It's very hard to say how many drawings you need, but I guess like managing expectations is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think timesheets we do, and it's always reflective of what people have been doing. And I've done timesheets all my career, and to be honest, I always wrote down whether they wanted to or not, how many hours I've been doing. I know Sue, in one of her previous practices, had exactly the same conversation. She was working all hours and was only told, no, you can only put down your 7.5, 8 hours, whatever it is that's in your contract. But genuinely, I use that data all of the time to assess what is profitable and what isn't profitable, and tracking where projects might be going off the rails. So I know it's a pain. Everybody hates doing them, but it is very beneficial, and it has to be reflective, because ultimately, if there's you can't, if you've given a fixed fee to a client, you can't necessarily, unless the scope of services have changed, you can't go back and say, oh, whoopsie daisy, I've like under-egged that, please give me some more. Sometimes you can. It's always worth the ask. But you've got to be able to learn that information for the next time you do a fee, or, we do more and more on an hourly rate, because if they want us to work for them, then that's just the way we're going to work it at certain stages. Because you've got to, unless the industry as a whole is recording, particularly students' time, I would say, they're just giving a false impression to their board of directors or shareholders or whomever of how profitable they are. They're only profitable because they're getting people to work for free. So, and only by showing what the actual sweat equity has been, are you going to be able to force the hand of like perhaps the bigger companies to not be a race to the bottom for fees?
It's an interesting point, the right of passage argument. It's the same with all-nighters as students. I don't know if it still exists the way it used to do, but it was a badge of honour. It was like, how many all-nighters did you do?
Yeah.
I've just done 4 in a row. What's your record? And I think that's a culture that kind of lives on. But I think I forgot where I was going with that, actually. What were you talking about?
Timesheets.
Yeah, we're talking about timesheets. Right. Yeah, I do think when you're in practice, I can understand why if you're working on certain projects and you're really invested in them, you'll put more in. And you balance that with other projects which are efficiently run that you're not as invested in. And I suppose it's up to a practice to manage that. I remember going to a conference in London once, and it was all about, it was one of the SCOSA ones, and the heads were saying, well, you know, you big practices in London, you only make money by exploiting our graduates for the first 5 or 10 years of their career, until they get to the level where they're at the director level, where they'll be properly remunerated. So the whole industry is set up on a model where you have a right, you have to earn those, you have to go through those early years where you earn your right of passage to a stage where you reach a place where you're properly paid for the status. And I think that's it's a problem in the industry that it works on that model. Because if practices weren't paying low wages for the graduates, they wouldn't sustain decent wages for people who moved up
Or they only do the hours that they're contracted to do for the wage that they've been given.
Yeah. So I think that is, and in terms of working for free, I think the RIBA has just got to be more aggressive in clamping down. There should be no such thing as free internships in our industry.
Well, this was a big issue when I was at Foster and Partners, where we literally had people queuing up to do a free internship in order to get the name on their CV, and that makes it very hard to negotiate for a pay rise when you're, because your work is somewhat devalued by the fact that someone else is prepared to do it for free. And this was in the late 90s when when you calculated your timesheet, and then we were part of the 68% who never got overtime, definitely. So you worked out the number of hours you'd worked compared to your salary, that you probably would be earning something equivalent if you were working down at Burger King. But we didn't care because we loved it, and it was the badge of honour. And most certainly we were all young, we didn't have caring responsibilities, and that is not a long-term sustainable model. Timesheets are, I think, really important. When I was a director in practice, you need this information, and you want, I think, people to be honest about how long it takes so that you can work out, are we totally undercutting ourselves? And unfortunately, the drive in the industry to do it ever cheaper, and again, I don't want to start the conversation about, when we had an agreed fee scale, and we look at what we now charge for this same equivalent amount of work. Either we're working for free, I don't believe we've become that much more efficient, or we're doing less for the money. And I think the industry needs to be careful that we boxing ourselves in a corner by not charging adequately and not monitoring how money is being spent and how much time is being spent.
Do we need pay scales?
We have like salary bandings, and that's transparent. Everybody can see what band they're in, and there's obviously overlap, as there are. And we've only done that in the last couple of years, but I think that when you're trying to recruit, I think it's important. We're a small practice, so we're never going to be able to necessarily compete with the big boys on salaries, but you get, if you're working for us, then you get benefits in other ways in terms of the lifestyle and how your interests might be developed. And I think as an employer that that's a stronger pull for a lot of people than we perhaps would have always realised when we started out.
Yeah, I do think there's kind of seems like two types of mindsets with people graduating these days. And one is sort of like, I want to go to a practice that's going to treat me well, like decent pay, not working overtime all the time. And then there's the other mindset, which is, I really want to go to a star architect. I know they're going to kind of work me to the bone, but, you know, like I'll do it for the name sort of thing. So I do think probably those kinds of practices are still getting away with it, but probably the vast majority aren't as much, because the new generations coming into the workforce kind of respect their time a little bit more, respect their well-being a bit more, so would be a bit more choosy when like picking where to go, I guess. But then some are still saying, oh, I want to go to Foster's, I know what it's going to be like, but let me just get this on my CV sort of thing.
But hopefully they start to call it out. That's kind of what I hope that our roles are, in terms of people who've worked for us and then, you know, go back to university or go on to their next practice. You know, they've had an experience of how, have been shown how it can be done, and so they would hopefully then be able to call it out if that's not happening at their next practice, or if, you know, something that can be changed in studio culture at university is kind of like a butterfly effect. But, you know, we always we feel as if we were having these conversations when we graduated 1 or 2 years ago, and you know, part of it is quite depressing that some of it is still being talked about now. But equally, it is becoming a little bit more mainstream. Like Guerrilla Tactics this year is on Wellbeing in Architecture, and you know, it's becoming definitely talked about more. So one would hope that, you know, that there is a groundswell towards more people seeing that, and it not being in the same way like sustainability stuff like greenwashing. You know, I don't know what the equivalent would be in well washing. But you know, you know, actions speak louder than words, and you can have lots of aims and lots of policies and lots of targets and all the rest of it. But ultimately, the well-being of your staff, the retention of your staff, how often your staff are actually off sick, you know, whether they advocate you out in circles like this, is a far better barometer than anything else.
Just quickly, we'll sort of get on it in a moment, but we're sort of hitting on those points about people being like guerrilla tactics and stuff, and there are a couple of unions actually now, some in the UK and the US. And I got sent something this morning, if anyone's interested, a thing called Pay 100, which is a company who are basically asking for they're asking for everyone to contribute or to say what their salary is. They're anonymising all of the data, and then publishing it. I don't know what they're waiting for, like 3,000 things or something, but something to look into. But I'm curious how, like, what people view unionisation. There's a practice called Atomic who there was a sort of notable strike of all of their workers, which I think is the first time that's happened for a private sector architectural practice. Would people be, you know, I think it's probably different being a director now, but I'm just interested, would people have joined a union when you were just starting out?
I think if it would have been looked down on at the time, I would have thought. You know, I think some of the terminology that we've all been using, sort of like doing your all-nighters as badges of honour, I think if we turned round in those days and said we want to join a union, would be
Blackballed.
yeah, or exited in a different manner. So yeah, I don't know. I think there would have been some intimidation back then, but if it was anonymous, I certainly would have been interested.
I think it kind of depends maybe on the size of practice as well. You know, I don't envy directors of the Fosters and things, because like the HR of a small practice is exhausting enough, and you know, you can never please everybody all of the time, and everybody responds to stress differently, everybody works differently, and you can't, you know, one blanket thing is not going to please everybody. And so I suppose from a union point of view, I can see the benefit of that if you are in a bigger practice where you perhaps don't have a touchstone with your director, or you don't, you perhaps feel intimidated, where I was kind of hope on in like the SMEs, and you should be able to judge take the temperature of your staff on a daily basis because you're in usually the same room as them. So I don't know enough about it, I don't think, to make an educated statement, but I think it might depend on like the size of the practice itself.
I think union is the wrong. I think that is not the problem, because it suggests that the problem is between employers and employees. But actually, I think the problem is bigger. The employers are architects as well, not just the employees. And actually, it is for architects together to solve this problem. That includes employers and employees. The problem, I think, is for architects in the wider construction industry. So if we want to organize ourselves, well, let's have a really good RIBA, ARB, let's work together. But I don't think we need a union of architects, because that seems to me the wrong fight to fight. I would much rather we reinforce our professional bodies and give them some teeth and some ammunition to go out there, and I'm sure we'll come onto it, protecting not just the title, but maybe the function of the role of the architect. Now, that is the sort of thing that, a political cause I would sign up for, but I wouldn't join a union. I haven't joined a union, I'm in higher education as well, which is a different thing.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point to say about protecting the function. I've seen students who use Part 3 architect, which is probably not the worst thing in the world, but that's not using the title properly. And there's all sorts of different roles now that use the title with a suffix. But yeah, I suppose protection of function. Do you think that would be I mean, how does that would have to come from the ARB, presumably?
Well, the ARB would tell us that that was not their role and it's not their remit, because that is not the Act. The Architects Act, as far as I understand it, was set up to protect the title architect, and that is, that is their scope of works. They don't go beyond that. I think it would help enormously if the function of the architect was protected as it is in other European countries. And to try and be a bit more positive, I actually think there are now opportunities as architects under the new Building Safety Act, for example, the role of the principal designer, which is a role that seems to be increasingly enshrined in law, that maybe as architects, I think we're quite well placed to take on that role, that would allow us to kind of have function protected by the back door indirectly. I think, until the government changes, I think the idea of us lobbying government to protect the function of architect is very ambitious but highly unlikely.
I agree. Protection of function is a difficult one, because you're getting rid of building control and passing it all. There's pros and cons for protecting function. I think talking about clients, working with clients, I totally agree. I think one of the criticisms of architectural education is you can be taught by architects mainly, and you don't meet people who meet engineers. You very rarely meet clients. And we try to replicate that in some of our live project work. So we don't want to do live projects where you build a very bad structure somewhere and think you're a carpenter. we want to do a live project where you talk to real people as clients and learn those, the not soft skills, the hard skills of working, trying to understand what a client really wants and needs, and get away from the ego of the architect that it's being something that's like a fine artist. Not that fine artists are big egos, take that off the record. Yeah, I think those soft skills, but I also think the education of clients. I show students a graph where it says the decisions made in a building process, the decisions made at the beginning have massive cost implications and massive implications down the line. The decisions made over here, where you've got site managers being paid twice as much as you are minuscule compared to those decisions you made over there, and you're getting paid peanuts for those decisions. And valuing the the value of design decision making is something we need to educate clients with. I have a friend who's a PI insurer, and this is what you should educate clients. If somebody comes in front of a judge and they're not a registered architect, the chances of them being found against is much lower than an architect. So we'll give lower insurance to non-architects to design buildings than we will give to architects. But nobody tells the clients the reason is because there's no liability. You cannot get that liability back in the courts because you've not employed an architect. We need to educate clients of the value of design and the value of using somebody who's trained to do the job. And I think that's separate from protection of title. I think that is about lobbying. That's about our professional bodies lobbying the big clients.
I think that also speaks to like responsibility and what we're responsible for. How do we define that? Do you think if we define it, we're able to define our responsibility better, would that help in terms of like contractually? You know, for example, Lisa, working with residential clients, that's a completely different game in terms of responsibility. And my experience was that, you know, you're working with the layperson who you have to abide by consumer rights. I remember from my part three. But that's a completely different challenge to a larger scale thing where you might have a responsibility matrix. I'm just, how do you deal with that sort of managing responsibility and what the client expects of you?
Well, I think it's about managing expectation as well. I think we have a very, very short window to educate our clients on what we do, and that's in the that's in our like 1 hour free initial consultation process. You've got 1 hour to tell clients what we do, how we do it, how we're going to add value, and how much we're going to charge. Because the clients are listening until they hear the money. As soon as they hear the money, that's it. They won't listen to anything else. So that, for me, it's about kind of learning how to talk to clients, to explain things, and
learning to listen.
Learning to and dealing with different types of personality as well. Because you've got clients who are just, you know, different types of learners, and they want to see what you're talking about, or they want to hear, or they want to see you going into detail, and they want to know specifics, and you've just got to nail it that first time, and then we back it up with our fee proposals and our briefs, which have all been kind of vetted by our sort of legal profession in line with the Consumer Rights Act, which and ours are more rigorous than the RIBA forms of agreement as well, because, you know, we'd like to adhere to best practice and not just what the RIBA say.
I suppose it probably varies as well based on whether you have an experienced client or not. So that's quite interesting, because you get to kind of teach them what our responsibilities are, but with, say, a developer client, they've worked with loads of architects, they know what they're expecting probably already. So yeah,
Shorthand.
quite different, probably.
We've again similar sort of experience. We do less residential stuff now, but we did a lot in our early days, and at one point we always just used to send out standard RIBA sort of short small projects letter, which was like very legal. And now we don't do that. You know, we do very similar sort of like initial chat, a fee in a way that, you know, makes sense to somebody, and then we follow it up with the T's and C's, because by that point you've got them on board, and that, you know, again, it's just experience.
Looking at the time, do people have questions?
Yeah, and I was quite interested in what you said about the kind of struggle of getting into practice from part one, and you know, you mentioned that lot of factors say that part ones are maybe used when they get into practice, or there's a feeling about you. Do you think there's a role for some sort of more formal structure in the year out, or a role for kind of training by the practice themselves? I know we should be mentoring and teaching, but is there a more formal structure that would be a benefit to kind of take students from a part one into practice?
I think you accept that, at least for the first 6 months, that student is not necessarily going to be in any way profitable, and you've got to kind of build that into your business plan. Some people are better at mentoring. Some people are better at mentoring than others. And I mean, I have, you know, there's new things, like there's the apprenticeship route, and there's like the scheme in Sheffield and things, where you are doing a bit of both. And I would kind of hope in time that will sort of level itself out a little bit. But when, you know, as an architectural employer, I see it as our responsibility to sort of take that person under your wing and give them the time to be able to become useful, because once they've hit that, you know, it's golden, you know, and you don't want them to go back to uni.
And obviously there's the PEDR system, which in theory should be a way for people to develop as they're going through that year, but just most people just leave it to the end, and there's no real structure to it. Kind of seems a bit outdated in a way. I don't know if there's a way of changing that, so you're learning more specific things. I don't know.
I just wondered if there was some sort of, like, I know you talk about the university and education, there is kind of set kind of goals or kind of play, march of mental at a certain point, and especially if students have been working in that process, having a looser version of that to come into.
We've just
Every practice is different.
well, we just introduced like a probation checklist. So you've got like 3 months of probation, and you know, some of it is just like, do you know how the office works and where to go if the fire alarm goes off. But then everything else, you know, have you actually read the code of conduct, and you know, do you understand how the class system works on our particular CAD system? You know, it kind of covers what should be the basics, really, because sometimes if you're busy, it might get missed. So it's as much for us as it is for the student as well. So something like that could then potentially be built upon. But it depends very much on what school they've gone to, you know, what their drafting skills are like, what their CAD capabilities are, whether they've used your system before. There's so many other things. Some people might not have ever worked in a professional environment before. You know, their job up until this point might have been in a supermarket or working behind a bar or something, and that learning of professionalism is just as important in those first few months, listening to how people answer the phone, how they deal with clients, what happens if there's a problem. You know, all of those not so soft skills are as much as can they draw up a planning level plan for a house extension or whatever you'd expect them to be able to do.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting evening. I'm interested in the word well-being, which is part of the title. And I'm just wondering if, given all your experience, if you're advising young architects about their future, what do they need to take into account in terms of their well-being? What do you understand well-being to mean? What does it actually mean? Because the figures you show are quite extreme in terms of people that are going through some quite difficult times. So, you know, how would you coach Ian used, coach people, you know, to cope with issues to do their well-being?
I think some of it is the ethos of the practice, and that comes back a lot, I think, to the long hours. You as a director have got to be the exemplar of going home at whatever time, and you know, not being available all of the time and showing, which is hard, you know, particularly when it's your own practice because you are constantly checking stuff. And well-being is different to other people, and I sort of touched on that earlier. You know, one size doesn't fit all, and throughout life, you know, as people have different responses to different situations, but you can't explain to somebody who hasn't bought a house how stressful it is. You can't explain to somebody who's not had children how completely life-changing and exhausting and everything and stressful that can be. You can't, you know, all of those life experiences, whether it's getting divorced or going through the menopause or whatever. Hopefully you don't have to do all of those things in your lifetime, but some poor soul probably will do. And so you've got to, I guess, be able to have an environment where people can raise concerns if they are feeling overwhelmed either by work or external factors, and appreciate that people are going to respond differently to how you might have responded to it. As a side segue from that, I think we have a responsibility as an employer to make sure people understand what the safety nets are. You know, you can have policies and you can talk to people and you can have reviews and you can do away days and all of those sorts of things, which are really important. But there's also got to be the practical side of it. And from personal experiences last year of having, you know, of having accessed quite a few of these things, you know, things like the ABS, and, you know, knowing that there, as a practice, you might have health insurance, even if it's a low-level thing, do people know about it? Can they ring somebody if they want to talk to somebody that's not you? You know, could I have a show of hands? Who's heard of statutory sick pay? All right, those who've heard of it, do you know how much it is? Yeah, okay. Those who know how much it is, do you know how long it lasts for? No. So all the employees in the room are going to hate me after this, but you can't get mentally or physically better if you are worrying about getting back to work because you need to pay your mortgage. And you have a responsibility to yourself to make sure you understand what your financial situation is. If you went off sick tomorrow, you know, either from mental illness or because, God forbid, you broke your mouse hand, you know, how long, you know, you only get sick pay for 6 months and it's £90 a week. So I'll let you do the maths as to how much the difference there would be between that and your salary. Now, a lot of practices, I would hope, us included, we have within our employment contracts that on top of your statutory leave, you get 10 days of sick pay, full pay, every 12 months. Because as a small practice, if someone's got a stomach upset, I don't want them coming in until they're 48 hours clear, because then that will wipe out the rest of my staff. But they would be more tempted to come in if they weren't getting paid. And, you know, once your sick pay runs out, then what happens? You do have the likes of the ABS to turn to, but have your staff heard of things like income protection insurance? And you're not a financial advisor, but people don't necessarily know about that stuff. And I think you have to at least signpost people in a direction so that they can take responsibility for making sure that they know that their rent and their mortgage will get paid if they did have to take a long period of time off sick. Because, you know, you can't get better if you're worried about all of that financial stuff in the background as well. And I think that is as, you know, is as important part of well-being, is understanding what your safety nets are and your staff knowing where that they can access from. Quite a lot of like random things like your office insurance sometimes has like legal helplines or mental health helplines that just become part of their package. Do your staff know where they can get to those? And that comes from personal experience of being off for a year and, you know, my sick pay running out, and then my my income protection insurance kicking in. So, you know, it is worth, it can be expensive, but if you're, as an employer, you've got the opportunity to do even basic level healthcare insurance, that means that people can talk to a GP 24 hours a day, or they can ring a mental health line, or they can get help with their dental costs or whatever. And to me, commercially, it is better to be able to give people those 10 days off sick, full pay, and pay for their bit of healthcare, because that is cheaper ultimately and more efficient than somebody being off for 2 weeks or making the whole of the company poorly.
People okay for a couple more questions? Yeah.
So, Alex, you mentioned before about maybe the solution to your union should be more about architects together trying to fix the issues. Sorry, I think it's a really good point. But I wonder if the employers know that they have to do the inviting to that conversation, because as an employee, whatever side of practice it is, there's still an imbalance of power. There's still, even if you're pallying in the office together all the time, the employer still has the power. So you can raise as many issues as you want. You can talk about working hours, you can talk about whether or not you're acceptable out of hours, but you, as an employee, don't always feel comfortable bringing that. Again, regardless of the side of practice or the whole sort of HR or whatever, that it's sort of that because of that imbalance of power, you being the employee and you being the employer has to begin conversations within every single company. So I guess my question at the end of that is, how is that going to be put in place? How are people going to help that?
Well, I think if I was to answer that question, it brings us back to what I was saying about a strong strong professional body like the RIBA has a code of practice, which means if you sign up to it, then you don't mistreat your staff, and you have certain common rules that should apply to everyone. And in the same way that I would expect a professional body to advocate for the profession and fight our battle with industry and government, of course I would equally expect them to rigorously enforce those standards within chartered practices as well. I still don't believe that unionising it solves the problem, insofar as that, if a group of employees are members of the union, the conversation still needs to happen between the employer and the employees. It doesn't make that problem go away. So, but I do still feel that this problem is a problem that we share as employers and employees, rather than a kind of, I don't believe that employers are out there kind of purposely exploiting their staff entirely intentionally. So, I mean, maybe, but I would love to find that employer, he would, well, no one would admit it. But I think a lot of it is to do with bad management, but I don't think they set out to, exploit their staff and said, I reckon I can get away with employing 10 part ones and working them to the bone, because it will not work long term. I just don't believe it.
I think, go back to my point, is if employers don't ask, they don't always know. So, whilst no, I don't think that most employers set out to exploit that at all. If you don't start the conversation and say, are you actually happy? Are you overworked? Then they won't find out, because it's scary to speak up on the other side.
Yeah.
We'll do one more, and then if people want to keep... I mean, is everyone else happy to stay? Quite a few people have shuffled off.
I need to leave.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I think I'll take one more, and then if people want to just sort of mill around, there's still beverages to be consumed, so people are welcome to stick around and chat if anyone wants to go.
It's more to answer your question, Rob, really, what is well-being? So for me, and something I sort of have been advocating a lot recently, is just talking. I know we're here today, but taking it back to when I was a student, getting involved with the university, getting involved with the student society, talk to the staff, tell if students in the room, if you're not happy with something, the tutors are mind readers, talk to them,
They might say no, get on with it. They might say, okay, great idea. When you get into practice, if you're not happy, talk to your staff members, talk to your boss. They might be scary, your tutors might be scary, bosses might be scary, but unless you don't, you sometimes have to bring it to the table. And then if you get a response that you don't like, or is not the right answer, or not necessarily the right answer, but a response that is negative, then the world is still a bigger place. The jobs, okay, the press is like, oh, jobs, architects go up and down. Look for another job. Look for another place. That's your answer. And equally, in the career that we're all in, if there's nothing there, there's always opportunity to start on your own. It's out there. So I think that, yeah, well-being is talking, and the more we talk, then the more things are going to progress. So internally, with colleagues, if someone's not happy, we talk amongst ourselves. I encourage them to carry on raising it. Up until it gets raised, you're not going to get a response. So I think talking is the best thing to do it. And then, like I say, if you're not happy with the answer, I think that sort of guerrilla tactics, whatever, you walk away, you find another job, and then when you do get into the working world, and you then go, oh, here's my notice, and an employer goes, why are you leaving us? It's like, well, I asked to raise this on this day, you ignored me, blah, blah, blah. And then you, as long as it's all evidence, you can go, well, look, the architecture's a small world, I'm not walking away in a nasty way, but this place has better staff facilities, has better staff options for financial health, mental health, and that's now. Recently I've been in my new job a year. When I was looking for that job, I was looking rather than just the salary, what are the working hours, what are those things, and there was multiple opportunities out there. We can choose where we want to go. If we're not happy where we are, then again we've got opportunities to either talk about it or move. So I think, yeah, everyone just keep talking in my eyes.
Yeah, I think the key point is dialogue. I think we're all in this room contributing to the dialogue. I think that's the biggest point, is having these conversations and making people feel more comfortable having these conversations, and just conversations about mental health in general. I've put some resources here, just if anyone needs help with anything, please do, just like we're encouraging them to talk about it. Can we please just have, I'd like to thank Matt and Lizzie at LIF, JJ, Maria at LIS, for all of them for contributing towards the event. Matt helped out with David and his dad for very kindly offering to record it, so we'll make the recording available afterwards. Can we just please have a round of applause for the panel?